The first time I saw it, I thought it was just a strange quirk of the old house. I'd moved into my granddad's place after he passed, a two-story Victorian on the edge of the woods that felt more like a museum than a home. It was huge, full of dark wood and shadows, and the attic was a forgotten labyrinth of his old possessions. One evening, about a month after settling in, I was down in the kitchen making a terrible attempt at pasta when I noticed it. A small scratch, almost imperceptible, etched into the surface of the antique wooden dining table. It was perfectly straight, maybe an inch long. I chalked it up to an old mover's accident or maybe even one of Granddad's own little mistakes. I wiped it down, forgot about it. The next morning, it was back. Not the same scratch, but a new one, a parallel line a hair's breadth away from the first. Two small, straight lines, perfectly carved. I paused, genuinely confused, running my finger over the fresh mark. It was definitely new. The wood felt raw where it had been scored. I told myself I was crazy, that I'd missed it the day before, or maybe the wood was just warping in the old house's dry heat. I covered the table with a thick cloth that afternoon. The third morning, I ripped the cloth off as soon as I woke up, stomach heavy with dread. And there it was. 3 lines. A fresh new score next to the first 2. Now it was a pattern, an intentional mark. I knew deep down this wasn't accidental. It wasn't natural. I started obsessively checking the table. Every night I would clean it until it gleamed, then stand guard for an hour or so, waiting. Nothing. I started setting up crude traps, balancing cutlery precariously near the table's edge. Nothing was disturbed. The lines kept coming. Day after day, a new, small, perfectly straight line would appear, always in the morning, always fresh. It started to consume me. I lost sleep. I'd check the table in the middle of the night, flash my phone's torch across its surface, searching for the perpetrator. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? "Officer, there's a ghost in my house with a very specific obsessive-compulsive need to scratch my table once a night." By the end of the second week, there were 14 lines. They spanned almost the entire width of the table in one corner. It looked like some sort of grim tally. I stopped eating in the kitchen. I covered the table with a dozen blankets and weighted them down with books. It didn't help. The next day, line 15 was scored right through the fabric of the top blanket and into the wood beneath. I started thinking about what my granddad had told me about the house. He said he bought it cheap from a desperate man after a strange incident. The man's daughter, a quiet girl, had suddenly refused to speak, communicate only by drawing long, straight lines on things, walls, notebooks, her own skin. She was eventually institutionalized, but before they took her, she spent all her waking hours in the dining room. I stood there looking at the 15 lines. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The lines weren't randomly positioned. They were grouped. 2 small groupings of 5 lines, then a grouping of 4, then a single line. 15 total. Then I realized the latest scratch, line 16, would be tomorrow. I walked over to the nearest wall, a smooth plaster surface, and saw it. Faintly etched into the paint, barely visible, but undeniably there, was another set of lines, a pattern that seemed to be spreading from the table to the walls, up the banisters, and into the very fabric of the house. I couldn't live there anymore. I packed a bag and left the next day, not caring about the furniture or the money I'd put into the place. I found a tiny apartment downtown. It was clean, modern, and blessedly free of any antique furniture. A week later, I was on the call with the estate agent trying to sell the old place when I looked down at my new, cheap IKEA kitchen table. Right there, in the polished pine surface near the edge where my hand always rested, was one single, perfectly straight scratch. The silence on the phone was deafening as I stared at the mark, realizing that the house hadn't been making the tally at all. The tally was about me.
It was the summer after my layoff that I finally decided to tackle the great American road trip. I bought a cheap, battered camper van, named her Wanderlust, and set out to see the country, needing a clean break from the fluorescent-lit misery of the tech world. My first month was glorious. National parks, roadside diners, endless skies. But then I hit the desert, and things took a distinct turn for the strange. I was somewhere in Arizona, deep in the desolate expanse that felt like the end of the world. I pulled off the main highway and found a secluded, abandoned lot to spend the night. It was silent, absolutely black, and the kind of quiet that feels like a weight pressing down on your chest. I woke up at about 3 a.m. because of a sound, a quiet, rhythmic scraping. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy chain across the cracked asphalt just outside my van. I lay absolutely still, heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the slow, deliberate rhythm of the drag. Shkrr, shkrr. I peered through the tiny gap in my blackout curtain. But the night was an inkwell, nothing to see, but the sound was right there, inches from the side of the van. I was completely alone, miles from any town. I pulled my knife out from under the pillow and waited. The scraping stopped, and the silence was even worse than the noise. Then I heard a different sound, breathing. Not the soft puff of a sleeping person, but a ragged, wet, labored intake and release of air. It sounded enormous, like a bull that had run a marathon. And it was directly outside my window. It stayed there for what felt like an hour, just breathing, hot and heavy against the thin aluminum of the van. I could smell something metallic, almost rusty, seeping in through the vents. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't dare breathe myself. I just squeezed the knife handle until my knuckles were white. Just before dawn, the breathing stopped. And I heard the scraping return, receding slowly into the distance. Shkrr, shkrr. It faded away completely, and I felt the tension drain out of me in a rush, leaving me shaky and drenched in sweat. When the sun finally rose, casting long orange shadows, I scrambled out of the van, expecting to see a huge set of footprints or drag marks. The ground was just cracked, dried dirt and asphalt. Nothing. But there was something on the side of the van. A vertical row of 5 thick, muddy smears, each about the size of a man's palm, running from the rear wheel well up to the back door. They were too high to be handprints of someone casually walking by, and they weren't mud. They were dark, viscous, and had a definite sickly sheen. I tried to wipe one away, but it resisted, clinging to the paint. I drove all day, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that dreadful silence. I found a gas station in a small, forgotten town in New Mexico, and the attendant, a man with a face like worn leather, looked at the van as I was filling up. "Rough night?" he asked, his eyes lingering on the sticky marks. I just nodded, not wanting to say anything. "You got a hitchhiker," he said, and his voice was completely flat. "Out there they call them the sleepers. They attach themselves. Don't worry, they just travel with you a while, take a few sips from the tank, sometimes a little oil. They always leave a mark." He walked over and pointed at the marks. "See that? That's iron oxide, rust. They're old, built-up things. Don't clean it off. If you scrape the metal, they know you're trying to get rid of them. They won't like that." I stood there, speechless, looking at the marks. "Just let 'em ride," he continued, leaning in close, "until they get where they're going. They'll just drop off then. You'll wake up one morning, and the marks will be gone." I drove for another 2 days without stopping, terrified to be alone in the dark. On the third morning, in a sunny parking lot in Colorado, the marks were gone, clean as a whistle. I sighed, relieved, and promised myself I'd stick to state parks from now on. Later that afternoon, I pulled up to a traffic light and checked my side mirror. Stuck right to the rear bumper, swaying slightly in the breeze, was a long rusted chain dragging slightly on the street. Shkrrr, shkrrr.
My sister, Clara, was always the sensitive one, the one who saw things others didn't. She'd always talk about the hum in our childhood house, a low-frequency vibration she said was always present, always listening. Everyone, including me, dismissed it as a quirky anxiety thing. It was just an old building settling, or maybe the electrical grid. She moved out when she turned 18, needing distance from what she called the house's pressure. She lived a happy, quiet life for years, but she was never quite herself when she came back to visit. She would look strained, like a knot in her stomach was tightening every time she crossed the threshold. Then the accident happened. A drunk driver on the highway. She didn't make it. The grief was immediate and crushing, and the guilt followed right behind. I felt horrible for dismissing her deepest fears for so long. A month after the funeral, I was back in the house, going through her old room, packing up her things. Her room was still painted the faded blue she'd chosen when she was 12. I found a journal tucked beneath her mattress. It was thin and bound with twine, not like the fancy ones she used for school. I opened it, hoping for a final message or a happy memory, but what I found was something entirely different. It was mostly scribbles and drawings, distorted faces in charcoal, geometric shapes, and pages filled with the word hum. On the last page, written in large, shaky capital letters, was a single cryptic sentence. "It didn't let me leave." I shivered, the old house suddenly feeling much colder than it had a moment ago. I stood up and walked down to the living room, flipping the journal pages over and over in my hands. The phrase, "It didn't let me leave," kept repeating in my head. I went to my mother, holding the journal out. She just shook her head, tears welling up. That was after the accident. That's the part that hurts the most. She was finally getting away, and that thing dragged her back. I asked her what she meant, and my mother explained that on the night of Clara's death, she'd felt an unusual deep vibration throughout the house, a low, powerful, continuous shudder that rattled the windows, the hum, amplified. The phone call came an hour later, telling us about the crash. My mother never connected the two. but Clara had. In the journal, on the page before the final entry, there was a detailed, frantic drawing of the house's exterior with thick black lines radiating from the foundation toward a little stick-figure car driving down the highway. I suddenly remembered something Clara had told me when we were kids, that the hum was angry when she left, that it wanted her back because it was hungry. She said it fed on the anxiety of its occupants, and when they left, it had to find a way to bring them home. I looked around the living room, and the house felt different now, less like a collection of wood and plaster, and more like a single colossal entity. I could hear a faint vibration now, a subtle thrumming in the floorboards. The hum. I finally heard it. I dropped the journal and ran out of the house. I drove to the local motel and booked a room. I didn't go back for the next 3 days. But on the 4th morning, I woke up in the motel bed and knew I had to go back. A powerful, unshakable urge. Not grief, not duty. It was a compulsion. I drove back, pulled into the driveway, and my mother was outside tending to a patch of weeds. I asked her what she was doing. She didn't look up. There's a strange patch of dry rot in the basement, just beneath Clara's room. Has to be scraped clean. Don't worry, I'll be finished soon. I can hear it now. It wants me to stay until I'm finished. She stood up slowly, and I could see the same dark circles under her eyes that Clara used to have, the same haunted look. As I watched, she pulled a small rusty utility knife from her pocket and walked toward the basement entrance. She paused at the door, turning back to me with an expression of pure terror, and whispered, "I tried to leave. I really tried, but the hum is too loud." The last thing I heard before the basement door clicked shut was the low, undeniable, hungry vibration deep in the core of the house. It was waiting for me next.
I used to spend my summers working as a fire lookout, a job that suited my quiet, reclusive nature perfectly. My station was Tower 42, nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. It was just a small glass cabin perched on top of a 50-foot steel trestle. My only company, the radio static and the occasional deer. I loved the isolation. I was completely cut off. The first strange thing happened about 6 weeks into my season. I'd established a routine: wake, scan the horizon, record the weather, eat, repeat. But one afternoon, while running my regular sweep with the binoculars, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. About 10 miles out, near the edge of a large, unnamed clearing, was a brightly colored banner strung between 2 massive cedar trees. It was vivid yellow and looked like one of those cheap vinyl signs you see advertising a furniture sale. It made no sense. This area was protected, unreachable by road, and certainly not a place for any kind of commercial event. I immediately grabbed the radio, but the signal was weak, just a crackle of static. I recorded the coordinates and the sighting in my log, assuming it was some hiker's misplaced marker, though the size of it was alarming. The next morning, I scanned the clearing again. The yellow banner was still there, but now, about 100 yards away from it, I saw a second one. This one was bright blue, again strung up high and visible. I tried the radio again, still just static. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. 2 banners, miles from civilization. What were they doing? I started to wonder if they were some kind of markers for an illegal operation, a logging or mining claim, maybe something worse. On the third day, the pattern was clear. There were now 3 banners, yellow, blue, and a new red one, forming a crude triangle across the clearing, and they were all bigger than I remembered. The wind was whipping through them, making them snap and flutter in a way that looked violent, even from 10 miles away. I spent the entire day fighting with the radio, desperate to report what felt like increasingly a trespassing invasion. Finally, late that evening, I got a faint signal through to headquarters. I breathlessly described the banners and their strange, creeping appearance. The dispatcher on the other end, a guy named Rick, sounded tired. He told me to stop looking at the clearing. He said that Tower 42 had been a problem spot for years, that lookouts sometimes got what he called field strain, which he assured me was just a minor psychological response to the solitude. I told him I was looking at 3 enormous primary-colored banners right now. They were clearly visible. Rick just sighed. He said there was nothing there. He then said something that chilled me completely. He told me the clearing was known to the local rangers as the mirror, because no matter what you see in it, it's only ever a reflection of what you brought with you. He suggested I take a day off the binoculars. I hung up, feeling completely dismissed. But Rick's words, "There is nothing there," rang hollow when I could clearly see the blue banner shift slightly as something tugged on its far corner. On the 4th day, I didn't need the binoculars. The banners were huge now, each easily 50 feet long, dominating the clearing. They were 4, then 5, then 6, expanding outward in a giant garish fan, yellow, blue, red, green, purple, orange. And they weren't just flapping. They were swaying in unison, slowly, rhythmically, like colossal, synchronized streamers, except there was no wind that morning. I looked down at my hands on the glass tabletop. They were trembling. I knew Rick was wrong. I was not hallucinating. But then I looked at the banners again, focusing on the nearest one, the yellow one. I realized I couldn't read the text on the yellow banner. Not even with the best magnification. It was just a black shape, a smudge. But the banner itself looked slightly translucent, and through the fluttering vinyl, I could see what was beyond it. It wasn't the trees or the opposite end of the clearing. It was the interior of my tower. The corner with my cot, my backpack on the floor, the stack of canned goods on the shelf. The yellow banner was reflecting the inside of my tiny, isolated cabin. I turned quickly, expecting to see a change in the glass walls, but they were clear. I looked back through the binoculars. Now the red banner seemed to be showing a perfect miniature image of my own face looking back at me, contorted in fear. They weren't markers. They weren't reflecting the world. They were reflecting me and my space, and they were getting closer. The whole garish spectacle slowly migrating out of the clearing towards the tower. I abandoned my post immediately. I just grabbed my pack and ran down the steel stairs, not looking back. I spent 3 days hiking out, stumbling through the brush, driven only by the terror of seeing my own reflection 10 miles away, growing steadily larger. I never went back. But every few months, I'll open a local newspaper, and there, buried in the classifieds, under Lost and Found, is a small, blocky yellow ad. It's always the same size, the same font, and it always just says, "We saw you. We remember the view. Come home to Tower 42.
My grandfather was a lighthouse keeper in the 1960s, which is how I ended up with his old cottage on the Maine coast. It was a beautiful, isolated spot. The cottage was small, cold, and right on the water, about a mile from the decommissioned lighthouse he used to tend. The cottage had one major flaw. The basement flooded constantly. I was down there one afternoon, after a particularly bad storm, trying to figure out where the water was coming from. It wasn't to see. It was fresh, cold, and seemed to be seeping up through the concrete floor in one corner. As I bailed the water out, I noticed a very strange detail. The seepage wasn't random. It was coming from a perfect 4-inch diameter hole that had been drilled directly into the basement floor slab. I stuck a metal rod down the hole. It went down a long, long way. I pulled it out, and the end was covered in wet silt and clay, but there was a faint metallic odor to it that was unsettling. A few days later, the water was back. I cleared it out again, and this time I decided to cement the hole shut. I mixed a batch of quick-dry concrete and prepared to plug it. But as I leaned down, I noticed a change. The hole seemed marginally wider, as if something had been working it from below. And then I heard it. A faint, repetitive sound coming from the darkness beneath the house. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. It was slow, rhythmic, and definitely sounded like something digging. I panicked and poured the entire bucket of concrete directly into the hole, watching as the slurry disappeared completely, taking the sound with it. I told myself it was fine. The concrete would set, and the problem was solved. 2 days passed. The weather was clear. I was sitting upstairs reading when I heard a distinct plink from the kitchen. I went to investigate and found a tiny 4-inch puddle of water on the floor near the refrigerator. And right in the center of that puddle, a perfectly cut 4-inch diameter circle of concrete, maybe an inch thick. The plug I had poured with cleanly ejected. I went back down to the basement trembling, and the hole was back. Wet, dark, and maybe a hair wider than before. And the sound had resumed. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. I called my elderly neighbor, an old fisherman who knew my grandfather. I asked him about the water. He didn't hesitate. He said, "That's the old man's well. Your grandpa dug it." I asked why it was inside the basement and why it was making that sound. The fisherman explained that my grandfather had used the hole not for water, but for something else. He was a very superstitious man, and he believed the sea demanded a tax for the safety the lighthouse provided. He would put something down the hole every week to feed what he called the salt tax man. My neighbor said that when the hole began to sound like something was digging up, not down, that meant the payment had stopped. I asked what my grandfather put in the hole. Anything that was dear to him, the old man said simply. Little coins, a bit of his hair, a tooth, but always a part of himself. You stopped paying the tax. That night I didn't sleep. The digging sound in the basement had intensified. It wasn't tap, scrape anymore. It was gouge, drag, and it was louder, resonating up through the floorboards. I finally went downstairs with a flashlight, utterly terrified. The hole was even wider now, perhaps 5 inches across, and the surface around it was damp and fissured. I shone the light down, and I saw something glinting in the dark. I reached down with a pair of pliers and pulled it out. It was a copper penny from 1967, one of my grandfather's offerings. The base of the hole was spitting back the past. But the digging sound was still there. And as I stared, mesmerized, I saw a new shape emerge from the mud at the bottom of the hole. It wasn't metal or stone. It was pale, glistening, and segmented. And it wasn't pushing dirt aside. It was flexing. It looked like an enormous, bleached finger, slick with deep, cold water, slowly, deliberately, probing its way up. Gouge, drag. The payment had stopped, and the taxman was coming to collect something far more valuable than a coin. I didn't wait to see the rest of the hand. I just ran, leaving the keys, the house, and the finger to the sea.
I started working at this massive corporate archival facility right out of college. It was a huge, concrete bunker of a building designed to house millions of physical records for decades. My job was simple: retrieve files from the lower levels and scan them. The files were kept in color-coded boxes on miles of automated shelving units, organized by a complex, obsolete system. The facility was designed with efficiency in mind, but the human element was clearly an afterthought. The lighting was fluorescent and harsh, and the lower levels had poor ventilation and no windows. The absolute silence down there, broken only by the whirring of the retrieval cranes, was what really got to me. It felt like being buried alive. My first few weeks were uneventful, tedious. But then I started to notice a recurring file. Its designation was T98333. I would pull it for scanning at least once a day, sometimes more. It was always requested under a different user code and for a different project. It was clearly a file of high importance, but when I scanned it, it was just a series of mundane engineering blueprints for the HVAC system of the building itself. I started to get curious about the file's contents, but my access was limited. One day, I pulled T98333 again, and this time the box was heavier than usual. I checked the internal tag. It was the correct file, but I could feel something loose and dense inside. I decided to open it, a serious breach of protocol, but the file was practically my daily companion. I unsealed the box and found the usual blueprints inside, but underneath them, buried in a foam cushion, was a small, crudely carved wooden doll. It was humanoid, about 8 inches tall, with a permanently surprised expression and tiny brass tacks for eyes. It smelled heavily of old formaldehyde. I was startled, not just by the unauthorized object, but by the overwhelming, immediate sense of wrongness it gave off. It felt warm, almost hot to the touch. I closed the box quickly and sealed it, but I pocketed the doll. I decided I would return it later, maybe put it in a different box to avoid a corporate panic. The next day, T98333 was requested again. I went to the location, and the retrieval crane brought down the box. I took it back to my scanning station. It felt lighter than I remembered. I ran the scan, and the digital record of the blueprints was perfect. But when I went to file the physical box, the internal tag had been replaced. It was still T98333, but the date and creation number were off. The handwriting was different. I opened the box again. The blueprints were still there, but the foam cushion was gone, and in its place was a second wooden doll, identical to the first, but this one was slightly larger and had a noticeably unhappy expression. A strange, childish dread settled over me. I checked the logging system. The official record showed I never returned the first file the day before. The system believed I still had it checked out, but the box was clearly back on the shelves.
Over the next week, the requests for T98333 came in relentlessly. Every time I retrieved it, the box was different, the internal tags were altered, and there was a new, slightly different wooden doll inside. Each doll was distinct. One was laughing, one had closed eyes, one seemed to be weeping. I started to notice that each doll was wearing a tiny, faded piece of clothing, a miniature corporate ID badge, a tiny pair of glasses, a scrap of a uniform I recognized from an old employee photo. I was terrified. I now had 5 dolls hidden in my locker, and the latest file request had just come in. I knew the box was waiting. I walked to the retrieval point. The crane was already descending with the box. I looked up, and for the first time, I looked not at the box, but at the enormous, automated shelving unit behind it. It was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the electricity. Then, high up on the shelf where T98333 had been stored, I saw a figure. It was small, hunched over, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait along the narrow metal grating. It was working on the shelves, meticulously replacing the file tags. It was a small, wooden figure about the size of a child, but it was absolutely naked. As it turned its head toward the weak ambient light, I saw the face. It was the latest doll, the one with the vacant stare, and it was smiling, a wide, impossible grin. It held a small, sharp knife in one hand and a thin scrap of red fabric in the other. It was cutting new clothes. It was preparing the next file. I dropped my scanner and ran, never looking back at the shelf or the box that was waiting for me. I left the dolls in my locker. I often wonder what my replacement found when they finally opened the requested file. T98333. I hope it was just blueprints.
My grandfather was not the type of man to leave a mystery unsolved, which is why he spent the last 10 years of his life researching the local legend of the unfinished road. It was a stretch of perfectly paved highway that abruptly ended in the middle of a dense forest about 50 miles outside of town. It had been built in the 70s and never completed, just stopping dead with a barrier of orange cones. My grandfather believed the road was incomplete for a dark reason. He claimed that the construction company responsible, a regional outfit called Blackwood & Sons, had unearthed something they couldn't control. He died before he could finish his research, so I inherited his notes, his obsession, and the strange, heavy sense of duty to complete his work. The notes were messy, full of cross-referenced news clippings about sudden worker disappearances and a local rash of what were vaguely called bizarre nocturnal incidents. I decided to visit the site myself. I drove out to the dead end one foggy afternoon. The forest felt unnaturally silent, swallowing the light. I walked past the orange cones and started to explore the asphalt beyond, where the road was supposed to continue. There was a massive concrete block set into the side of the road, covered in thick moss. I scraped it clean and found a plaque. It was a dedication stone from Blackwood & Sons, dated 1978, but the names were all scratched out, leaving deep gouges in the metal. The only thing legible was a faint inscription carved by hand below the plaque. They only left the gate open. I spent a few hours deep in the woods, following where the road was meant to go. All I found were old, rusted equipment and a few strangely patterned piles of rocks. I left around sunset. A week later, I came across the breakthrough in my grandfather's notes. He had found an old foreman who worked on the project. The foreman admitted that the road wasn't incomplete, it was finished. It went all the way through to the next county. But one night, a massive sinkhole opened up directly on the newly paved roadbed. The hole was not natural. It was perfectly rectangular, like the lid of a huge box had been removed. The company spent a week trying to fill it, but every load of dirt or cement they dumped in just disappeared. They eventually gave up, paved over the mouth of the hole, and put up the barricades, telling the state the road was unfinished. I went back immediately, driven by a new understanding. The unfinished road was a cover-up for a massive, sealed pit. I found the location easily, about a mile past the cones, exactly where the foreman described. The asphalt there looked slightly newer, smoother, and the earth around it was completely barren, nothing growing for 50 feet in any direction. I spent the next hour with a pickaxe and a shovel, working through the thin layer of concealing asphalt. After an immense effort, the asphalt cracked, and the pickaxe struck something solid beneath. Not earth, but a vast, thick sheet of concrete. I paused, breathing heavily in the quiet woods. I was about to expose a secret kept for nearly 50 years. As I prepared to swing the axe again, I heard a new sound coming from directly beneath the slab. It was a faint, musical note, a high, clear, sustained pitch, like a distant opera singer holding a single perfect tone. It was beautiful, but terrifying. I lowered the axe, completely frozen. The note grew louder, and the concrete slab began to vibrate beneath my feet. A second note, slightly lower, joined the first. The two notes harmonized, creating a rich, resonating chord that filled the silent forest. It felt less like sound and more like a gentle, internal pressure against my ears. The notes continued to layer, one after the other, forming a complex, evolving piece of music. It was stunning, hypnotic, and completely alien. It sounded like the music of the earth itself, or maybe something older. But then, as a seventh note joined the chorus, the perfect harmony broke. The music suddenly became something else. It turned raw, distorted, and agonizing. It wasn't singing anymore. It was a vast, multi-tonal scream of frustration and hunger. And then I heard the subtle change in the structure of the sound. The smooth notes were replaced by a grating, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone, and it was getting closer to the surface. I threw down the tools and ran. I raced back to my car, got out onto the main highway, and didn't stop until I was well out of the woods. I never told anyone what I heard, but a month later, I was cleaning out my car and found a small, dark speck on the floor mat. I picked it up. It was a tiny piece of coarse white material. It was a fragment of concrete broken off from the huge slab, and etched on its smooth side was a single, perfect musical staff with 7 notes written on it. The key signature was a simple treble clef, but the notes themselves were all wrong. They weren't recognizable. They were long, slender, and seemed to be slowly bleeding out of the staffs. The music had followed me home.